Hi, my name is Diana Karamakoska, and in this week's video, I will be talking to you about culture and communication. Communicating with people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds will be a very common occurrence, especially in Australia, where we have such a multicultural society. There are strategies for improving communication across different cultures, especially for those who may not be well versed in English. Culture is a common collective of beliefs, values, and shared understandings and patterns of behaviour of a designated group of people. It includes things like personal patterns of dress, emotional expressions and language, child-rearing practices, and the rules and values as to which their community must go by. In 2011, the Australian Bureau of Statistics stated that approximately 27% of Australians were born overseas. And this is a large portion of the population, so we can see why it's necessary to cover cross-cultural communication, especially in a health profession. So what are the components of culture? Well, it varies from the dress, to the customs, to their belief systems, values, practices, their foods, and their spiritual practices and beliefs. When we look at intercultural communication, it is a communication in which the sender of an intended message is a member of one culture and the receiver of the message is from a different culture. It is more than an issue of language translation, as cultural interpretations of illnesses, behaviours, and symptoms are important considerations to make in the health setting. What one culture might consider as a disease, another might dismiss it entirely, and this will change how you go about discussing this with your client or patient in an interview. When we look at culture and behaviour, we know that culture can influence, but not necessarily predict how people can think and behave. Health professionals need to first understand that cultures do differ. Each person has diverse experiences, worldviews, and values by which their behaviour is guided. And their culture also influences their health beliefs. Health professionals need to behave with compassionate acceptance of different cultures of their clients. So when we look at cultural viewpoints, we must consider the individual and their relationship issues, what their gender and gender roles are in that culture, how they go about their decision-making processes. Do they need to involve other family members? Or is it something they must deal with on their own in fear of disgracing the family? What are the attitudes of extended family members? Are they supportive, or do they no longer maintain contact with them? This is important to establish a support network in which your client can fall back on in times of hardship. And you also need to consider who is perceived to be the natural helper. Do they have other forms of therapy or relief in which they can source out from their culture, and how could you integrate that into your treatment if at all possible? Cultural viewpoints are another perspective that needs to be considered in this setting. Different cultures have different perceptions of time, their use of language, spiritualities and religion, physical or emotional issues as well, and the experience of trauma. An example of this is looking at Indigenous Australians and people from the Pacific nations. They tend to have a more relaxed sense of time, They don't necessarily go by the hours and minutes system in which we do, hence the phrase Pacific time. They tend to go about their day and their jobs according to the sun rising or setting, as well as the temperatures of the heat that day and the weather that influences what they will do in that day. Looking at another example, refugees from war-torn countries can be especially distrustful and limit communication or hold back information in fear of how you will interpret it. This should not prevent you from pursuing the discussions further. You need to establish an open and trusting relationship with these clients, ensuring that no judgment will be passed on what they say. And finally, another example is that people's belief systems may be vastly different from ours. In some cultures, the father is considered the main child rearer of the family rather than the mother. It is therefore essential to distinguish between such characteristics of a culture in order to discuss different matters with different people within the family. Alternatively, you could also request consent from each family member to involve them in the patient's healthcare and also to understand their history and story behind the situation.